Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So today we finally get to talk about Joseph Campbell. I'm pretty excited because I don't know if you can tell, but I've read a lot about Joseph Campbell, and I feel like there's a lot of really cool stuff we can say, a lot of interesting things we can talk about, and I think we'll be able to dig pretty deep into his ideas, maybe beyond just the surface level. There's a lot to say, and I think he has a lot of really interesting ideas for thinking about mythology. So maybe we can make today kind of a starting point for talking about that. Yeah. So previously we looked at Levi Strauss, we looked at Prop, we looked at Carl Jung, and now we can look at Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell is a good one to do after Jung because a lot of his ideas are kind of drawing on some concepts from Jung, but he's also thinking very much about structure in the same way that Prop is. So you can, to some degree, map some of his things to some of Prop's things. So he's thinking about the structure of a story, structure of a fairy tale or a myth, things like that. But he's also got a lot of his own ideas. Yeah, so let's, without further ado, let's dig right in. Okay, loading. So, who was Joseph Campbell? So Joseph Campbell was a scholar of mythology, and he was a sort of a scholar of comparative mythology. Jung's more of a psychologist. Campbell was looking at lots of different myths from around the world, trying to compare and understand them, trying to see what they all have in common. So there's a lot of debates over this. A question of, should you compare myths from different parts of the world, different ideas, different cultures? Because on the one hand, you can see an argument. Okay, the Greek myths are talking about things that are part of Greek culture, and the Hindu myths are talking about Hindu culture. But also, maybe aren't there things that they have in common? Are there ways that we can analyze myths and stories to look at lots of different myths from all around the world? And I think that there are. I mean, I think that's what we've been doing so far. I think we've been looking at things that just sort of stories in general have in common, and also the psychology that we work with have in common. Jung talked about these sort of universal archetypes that are found in different cultures around the world, but when they come into a specific culture, then it takes on a specific form. This version of the anima, this version of the monster or the goddess, things like that. So Joseph Campbell's working on a pretty similar framework there. He says basically, it may be objected that we are looking at, everything at once, but we should focus on trying to understand the structure of myths in the same way that Doctor, knows that there are so many different human bodies out there, but we can look at anatomy and say, okay, this is where the rib bone goes, and this is where the thigh bone goes, and this is where the heart and the lungs and the spleen are. We can look at the different parts of the body on one chart and then use that to understand lots of different human bodies. So that's basically Campbell's argument for what he's doing. He's saying, we have something to learn because there are different things. There are things that are present in all these different myths. And if we sort of figure out that structure, then we can use that to talk about each of the individual cases. But that's basically his take. And he was really able to look at all these different stories from around the world because he researched a lot of stuff. He learned about Native American mythology, Celtic mythology, Hindu mythology, Greek mythology, quite a bit of literature. One of his books is on James Joyce, which is interesting. So he's, got a pretty broad perspective on everything. But what he's best known for is his book, The Hero with the Thousand Faces. And The Hero with a Thousand Faces argues basically there's a fundamental pattern, especially when it comes to stories of the hero. So sort of throughout mythology, we keep finding stories of the hero, and this hero follows a similar trajectory through his or her journey to sort of interact with the world and find something important there to help their society. And so across different cultures, we find similar patterns. Now, it's not always the exact same thing, but once we start seeing similar pieces, we can we can put it together. We can see where the parallels are. This myth might have this bit of it, and this other myth might have this other bit of it, but we can see the sort of similar pattern that's going on there. And he called this the monomyth. which means the one myth. Now, I don't think he meant that that there's only one myth ever. I think he did argue that there were other types of myths than just the hero stories, but the one myth is almost the one myth to rule them all in a way, because it keeps coming up over and over and over again. So it's this one pattern that we see again and again and again, because this is one of the most significant patterns. Now, talking about Campbell is kind of weird and kind of interesting, because I think a lot of his ideas have actually already been pretty widespread. You might know them even if you don't think you know them. The idea of a hero sets off on a journey, the hero choosing to follow the call of adventure or refuse the call. You might have heard of these things before. And his ideas, The Hero with a Thousand Faces was written in 1940s. And in the time since then, his ideas were really influential on a lot of film, a lot of movie makers and fiction writers and storytellers, particularly in the realm of fantasy and science fiction, which draws on all this mythological stuff. So on the one hand, his idea of the hero's journey works really well in analyzing certain stories from literature and stories from mythology in general. It works really well on those. In addition to analyzing the most ancient stuff, it can analyze the more modern stuff. But we do have to be a little bit careful, because some people are actually doing it deliberately. So it might not be that the hero's journey appeared spontaneously. It might be there because these guys were influenced by Joseph Campbell himself, or maybe to a secondary degree from things that were previously influenced by Joseph Campbell. So it could be one thing is influenced by Joseph Campbell, and then another thing is influenced by the first thing. Just things to keep in mind. Star Wars, you might have heard that Star Wars was really influenced by Joseph Campbell's ideas. And I think that's true. I think also we have to be careful about it, because the hero's journey is not the same as just tell the plot of Star Wars, I think people can kind of go into it thinking that it is. I think if you go back and look at the original hero's journey, though, what we might say instead is that Star Wars is like a really good take on the hero's journey. It's one interpretation of how the hero's journey can go, but it's not the only way to do it. So I want to talk a little bit more about that too, the different ways you can do it. But we'll be looking at the hero's journey in relationship to films and to storytelling, and how people use that structure to tell memorable stories. So something to think about. But Joseph Campbell also is known for a series of video interviews he did around the time when Star Wars came out, which is called The Power of Myth. And I would show you one of these interviews, but I don't think I can upload them to DTL without breaking copyright. So what I have instead is a radio interview with Joseph Campbell, which I think will be pretty fun. So let me just lay out the basics in this video, and then we'll build on that in the next video. So the most important concept in the myth of the hero is that there are two worlds. There's the ordinary world, and there's the world of adventure, or the world of magic, or the world of the gods, something like that. And the two worlds are pretty different. In the ordinary world, it makes sense. It's ordinary. It's the things you do in your day-to-day. Your average life, nothing too special happening, kind of boring, pretty logical, pretty rational, things make sense. In a story, this might be your small town, or living with your tribe, or living, on a farm, or in a quiet village, or, just wherever you grew up. That would be where the ordinary world is. And the trouble with the ordinary world is, sure, it's fine, it's very safe, but it has a lot of rules, it has a lot of restrictions, and oftentimes it can lead to stagnation. The hero usually starts their journey because the ordinary world just isn't working for them. So they need to go to another world to find something more. And this is the world of adventure, the world of magic. when you find wizards and witches and magical helpers and donors and things like that. You find those out in the world of adventure. This is also where you find the gods. In the ordinary world, you wouldn't find the gods so much, but once you start going to the world of adventure, then you're interacting with the gods all the time, and finding magic spells and getting magical artifacts and things like that. And what all that stuff in the world of adventure really represents is this potential for growth, that important things are happening that have the power to change your life, that you are doing stuff that matters instead of just sort of being stuck with the status quo. And so it's sort of associated with life and energy. Sometimes it's also associated with fertility. So in the world of adventure, you can basically read magic, the gods, potential, psychological growth, and the subconscious as all being very much the same thing. So I think if we were to bring in Jung to this a little bit, since Campbell is building on a lot of Jung's ideas, the ordinary world is much like the conscious mind. This is the part of things where you think you have it all figured out and you're very logical. But when you go into the world of adventure, what you're really going into is your subconscious. You're going to these energies, both the dangerous parts of yourself and the sort of parts of yourself that have the potential to grow, that you haven't found yet. You're going into those by going into the world of adventure. So I think we would say that the world of adventure is kind of a metaphor or a symbol that these stories have for the state of personal growth. And if you think about this, this makes a really good structure for a lot of different kinds of stories, right? Because stories are really compelling when they sort of start off with someone was living in an ordinary way, but then something came into their life and changed things. And they had to change. It was time to change, and then they went and they found a change, a different way of being, a different way of doing things. That's a pretty interesting story, is to see how someone changed over time. So I think this is why the hero's journey is a good story structure. Maybe not for all stories, but for a lot of different stories, in addition to it kind of spontaneously arising in mythology. And in the stories, it's often a literal journey. Someone leaves home, they leave their small town, they go on an adventure, they go on a journey, but it doesn't have to be 100% literal. Like, for instance, if someone stayed in the same place, but they made a choice that, caused them to interact with a wizard or a sorcerer, or they, plucked a rose petal, and the gods came after them, or, in Beauty and the Beast, Belle, saves her father, goes into the Beast Castle. Any of those types of things can work for the idea of going into the world of adventure. We'll talk about the different steps and the different stages in this journey. This is Joseph Campbell's map. I think it's a little confusing because it goes counterclockwise, so I have another version of it here. So this is basically the structure of the hero's journey. The hero goes across the threshold through a kind of doorway into the other world, into the world of adventure, whether that's just sort of interacting with the gods more, or finding a magic spell that you have to deal with the consequences of that, or really literally going on a journey, like so many characters in fairy tales do. You go on some sort of journey, whether that's literal or inside the character's head. And they go through a series of transformations and challenges, and finally encounter some sort of ultimate struggle. And then, here's the thing, when they've made their entire journey, then they go back into the ordinary world, because they've discovered something that the ordinary world needed. The ordinary world didn't know that it needed magic, or it needed life, or it needed growth. But the hero is the one who wasn't satisfied with the way things were, and is able to go out to get those things and bring them back. So the hero goes home to bring those things back. But the hero can go on the journey again and again and again, if need be. But it's all about the relationship between these two worlds. Okay. So I'll pick things up in the next video where we talk about the specific steps.